Okay, I should be live. Tell me if you can't see the screen for whatever reason.
We can.
Great. Alright, so yeah, as I mentioned, like Craig is recording and I'm also recording through OBS myself. And yeah, probably gonna put it up on the Spiff YouTube channel. Depends a bit. But if you for whatever reason want like voice or something edited out, then just tell me and I'll make sure it happens. Yeah, so before we start also, obviously if you have any questions like during the middle of it all, like don't hesitate to just pop in. I'm gonna try to give adequate room to ask questions with each section, so it shouldn't be a problem. But like if something is confusing, if something you don't understand, don't worry to just ask. There's gonna be also it's gonna be a section at the end, like if you want to ask a long form question or anything like that. But I think that's more or less it. So without further ado, hello everyone and welcome. So nice that so many of you could join me. Today's lecture I call Why It's Important to Know When to Fold Them, which is a brief piece on decision making. The purpose of this lecture is to primarily demystify the decision-making processes and show the factors that drive us when we make decisions. Secondarily, I also want to empower students who might be joining in to empower them in their own understanding of their decision-making. And hopefully this lecture can also supply some tools for instructors that can help emphasize the decision-making aspect of fencing. So this will overall be a very broad categorized lecture. We're not going to look into like specific solutions to fencing issues or anything like that, or like what is the correct way to build specific decision-making skill in like certain areas, but rather we're looking at it from a fairly broad perspective. This is sort of a primer. So a bit of background about myself. I am an instructor at Club Chairman at Spiff. I've been fencing for about 7 years now with the club. I've been doing martial arts for about 10. And then for since about 2.5 years back, I've been the lead instructor for longsword at the club. I am also a professional game designer where I work at Toadman Interactive. And in my role as a game designer, I primarily work with like rules making, so to speak, and implementation of like design specific details into our games. Apart from fencing, I enjoy painting miniatures, and among my favorite games are strategical kind of games, and of course a lot of games fall under that category, not just like real-time strategy games and so on. But that's basically this perspective I'm coming from. So this lecture will be based on my experiences both in the sphere of fencing and in the sphere of being a game designer. So I'm trying to take what I've learned from that into fencing, basically. So the first part is about decisions and what makes some decisions different from others. First thing to know is that decision making is a natural process. We make decisions all the time. It's just that most of the time they're not important or meaningful enough. Because one thing I hear sometimes you see a fencer ask is like, oh, I need to improve my decision making ability, etc., etc. And I think it can sometimes be a bit of a false equivalence to look at it as some sort of entirely separate skill. I find it to be quite often like sort of a sum of several different parts. And when it comes to decision making in general, again, you make a lot of decisions. Like most of you probably had breakfast this morning. Hopefully a few of you have a routine regarding that breakfast, which means you're not really actively engaged into the decision making of what you're making for breakfast. You're just doing the thing you always did. However, if you think about it, you can probably recall when that routine like had to be changed for some reason, because again, that set up a situation where you had to be a bit more engaged into that situation. In game design, we obsess about meaningful choice. And me personally, not every game designer follows this, but me personally, I am a big fan of holding the meaningful choice or meaningful decision making as one of the pillars of game design. I think it was Chris Sawyer that also defined, or if it was Sid Meier, that defined a game in general as a series of interesting or meaningful decisions. If you're interested in designing games that contain strategical elements, it requires informed and meaningful decision making. At the very least, for the purpose of this lecture, fencing will be considered a game. The activity of fencing is something that requires both physical and strategical skill in almost all of its configuration. It doesn't matter if you are doing sparring at the club, testing out some things with a friend, or if you are in a high-stakes tournament. Most of the time these things applies. And especially in a tournament, you have literal game design rules that are intended to encourage or restrict certain actions. Ergo, most fencing bouts you will be doing will be a measurement of your ability to make decisions in situ, and not only in situ but also how you have performed with your decision making so far in your fencing journey. Your individual physical skills need to be applied correctly in this context. So, for example, even if you are the fastest person in the world, if you actually have no idea that you are this fast, you won't be able to apply that correctly. You lack the information to make the proper strategical choice utilizing your speed. Let's look a bit at the anatomy of a meaningful choice. Meaningful choice or meaningful decisions differ from a regular decision in a few categorical ways. The first one, which is very minor, is the issue of consequence. As people, we like to see that there are outcomes related to our choices, and when we think about it, we want them to be different. For example, in a very classic example in role-playing games, in video games, for example, is when you're talking to an NPC and you get a bunch of dialogue options, and after you did some scrutiny, you realize they all lead to sort of the same outcome. That feels like super stupid. You said different things, you were hoping for different outcomes. However, this is actually a bit of a lesser important nature in fencing, because honestly, most of the time you want to, for example, hit your opposing fencer. And that is always going to be some sort of goal. So unless you're very careful about exactly how you hit, the consequence matters a bit less. Yet it's something you want to be there, because without consequence there wouldn't have been a decision to make in the first place. But still, it is of a lesser importance. The second part that is important, and this is one is the most important, and that is that there's predictability in the decision. And the predictability comes in two ways. The first way it comes through comprehension and consistency. When you engage with systems or games or things in general, first of all, you want them to be comprehensive. Comprehensive either in the way they present themselves to you or in your understanding about them. If a system is so incomprehensive, either by its own design or because you have zero understanding of it, you will have a very hard time of understanding what it is you're supposed to do when that system presents you with a situation. Your decision making will become a bit random and haphazard as you are sort of struggling to understand what it's even asking from you to begin with. Consistency is another part. A system that is not consistent will appear as random as a system that is incomprehensive. Even if you basically understand what the system is doing, and it's not a very hard system, if it constantly gives you false data or results that don't correspond with what was previously given, like if you do the same action over and over and get a different result each time, that will also make it hard to predict what's going to happen every time you do an action. Small case study on the comic of Cow Tools from Gary Larson, where this is the one he made this, and he has never received as many emails about any other comic he made about what the hell is supposed to be going on in this picture. And he believes that it has to do with the fact that he made one of these cow tools sort of look like a handsaw. The three others are insanely incomprehensive. There is no way to understand what they're supposed to do, but one of them is clearly a handsaw. Had it been something different, first of all, it would have been a consistent thing with the rest of the theme, that the there were 4 objects that just didn't make sense, and if you would have had 4 objects that didn't make sense, you would have had a more comprehensive picture, simply because nothing made sense, so there was nothing to think about. But by the fact that the handsaw was comprehensible, people try to figure out what the rest of it meant as well. Fencing is, of course, fairly consistent and comprehensive if you look at it from the natural laws. That is, an action takes the same time to do over and over. Like if you do a cut a specific way, it's going to take the same time to do. It's going to have the same result depending on what your opponent is doing and so on. But it can be an issue with comprehensiveness. While you're still a beginner, you have not understood yet things about yourself, things about fencing in general, and things about your opponent. That might be difficult. But comprehensiveness is something you build in your fencing as you go along. That's why decision making becomes easier, simply because you're training more also. Another way that consistency can be informed in HEMA or fencing in general is, of course, through competitions and judges. If you have non-electrical scoring and you have judges that are maybe not great, you might find that the calls are inconsistent, which will cause frustration. Anyways, the other part of a predictable or the predictability part of decisions is, of course, that the decision is informed. This ties along with comprehensiveness quite a lot. This goes back to the idea that you need to understand what an action will do. You need to have information that can help you take meaningful decisions. That is, that you're learning things, again, about your opponent, about fencing, or about yourself, that help you understand what's going to happen every time you take such a decision. So for example, if you know that like you can make a cut that will land almost every single time, or if you know the factors behind what makes it land, that's going to make it an easier time making that decision, because you're sort of understanding. But if you have no information to go off, or if your opponent is so beyond your skill level that you can't even begin to visualize what they're doing, you gain no information and you won't be able to respond to their actions properly. The final part of a meaningful decision is motivation. Motivation would be called utility or utility value in game theory. And the way I describe this is simply the way we put value to certain actions that we do. Consider, for example, if you go to an auction at an auction house. There will be several items put out to bidding, and each valuator there probably puts a different valuation on each item. You can't know this necessarily, but the point is that the value of each item changes for each person that is bidding on it. Another way to look at it is, of course, if you're playing a fighting game, if you're selecting a fighter in a beat 'em up, that may be a cause of valuation as well, because if some character speaks to you more, or if you know how to play them better, you assign utility to that. You consider it to be valuable. In fencing, this can of course mean if you have 2 fencers out of distance, so no action can be taken, it might be considered valuable for either fencer to move towards the other fencer. That means that the isolated action of stepping forwards has motivation or value. Ultimately, I think information is the most important part. We're going to talk more about that, but making the decision informed is the best way to make sure it stays meaningful. Are there any questions so far? Taking that as a no. So, moving on to a bit of an interjection. In game design, it's very common to talk about flow and frustration. Flow is, of course, a simple way of describing the optimal challenge level of a game as the challenge or the game proceeds. The standard layout of a diagram like that is, of course, that a player who is understimulated in their challenge will become frustrated through boredom, whereas a player who is overstimulated in their challenge will become frustrated through anxiety or stress. That is, on the one hand, the challenge is so easy that they get bored, that they are not stimulated by the game, or the challenge is so hard that they give up. So game designers enjoy trying to find the perfect sort of flow as a game progresses. In a standard like single player game, for example, you try to sort of increase the pacing ever so often so that the player constantly feels challenged. Another way this is represented is through like your decision scope and engagement. So as fencers are taking decisions, or as players are taking decisions, if all of them are of the kind where, like, for example, you have to make twitch reactions, and like it's always like every single time you get to make another twitch reactions, even if the decisions themselves are sort of easy to take, the fact that you get bombarded with so many or so many decisions in pure quantity might still increase the frustration level, simply because like you're getting exhausted very quickly. I think that this curve is actually somewhat useful to look for when you're doing design drills or when you're looking at in sparring, because in competition you're going to be pretty happy if it's so easy that you get bored. There might be a edge case where it was so easy that you feel that you stole the medal from some up and coming fencer, but most of the time you're probably going to be pretty happy if it feels somewhat easy and you're somewhat engaged and still make easy wins. In sparring, however, when you get stuck with like the newest person, and you have to teach them, and if you're not feeling into it, you might get bored. Like, there are obviously ways for you as a fencer to like engage yourself even when fencing people who are of a lot lower skill level, but still you might feel bored and you might not enjoy it. But on the flip side, they probably might get super frustrated over never landing a hit. When looking at this flow curve, I also sometimes, the way I see it is that like people usually don't land in it directly. People usually are either dipping in and out from boredom and flow, or they're dipping in and out from anxiety and flow. And if you have to aim for one of them, I really encourage you to go for the higher one. It's better that you're having a situation where they're sometimes feeling stressed and going back to feeling like they can handle it, because this pushes people a lot more. If they're going in and out of like from boredom or not feeling stimulated into stimulation area, they will mask most of the actions as being too easy anyways. So, moving on the topic of decisions, and of course on the topic of the flow space, temporality is somewhat important. I'm going to use a definition from Tynan Sylvester's Designing Games, where he gives a simple definition to 4 kinds of decisions: non-decisions, twitch decisions, tactical decisions, and profound decisions. As a decision gets higher in complexity, they take a larger scope. And what I mean with that is the time it takes for you to form the decision in the first place, not the time it takes to execute the action. So this is before your body has started moving in response to the action that you have decided to do. A non-decision is one of 2 things. It's either a decision that is so obvious given the options ahead that you don't even take time to consider said options. Even though there are theoretical options you could perform in this case, or at a decision point, you don't take them and you don't even think about them because it's so obvious what you're supposed to do. There is another version of this where there simply aren't any other options to do. Like, you are either physically or like mentally constrained to do just the one thing. Both of these are types of non-decisions. Twitch decisions are based on our like base reactions, as in they demand the fastest reaction possible from us. It's like when you see an attack coming, and if you're still stuck in it thinking like, should I attack, should I counterattack, etc., you have to make that decision super fast, as fast as possible, and you have to come to accord with the action you're supposed to perform after it. A tactical decision, especially in fencing, would probably be seen somewhere like a bit outside of the normal distances, when you still have time to think like, okay, I'm gonna move in, see if they attack me. If they don't attack me, I'm just gonna attack them, work from that, etc. So like when you take a second, maybe 2, to just lay out a quick game plan in your head. Profound decisions are found a bit less in a fencing bout because they take a long time. It's probably how you change in the fencing bout as you fence, like what you're noticing about your opponent, etc., etc. But it's also probably what kind of happens outside of the fencing in general, just how you think about your fencing. Like if you agree with yourself that you need to come to another change. I think this 4th one is a bit less useful for our purposes, but if you're a game designer, it's pretty good to consider. But yeah, all of this is of course based on your your ability to reduce the decision scope. As you train, as you become better, as you acquire more information, and as you acquire more skill, and the system becomes more comprehensive to you, some of these decisions will reduce in scope. Some things will become easy and they'll turn into non-decisions. Some things will go from tactical to twitch, and etc., etc. So as you gain more skill, this decision scope hopefully shrinks for several of the actions you can do. Some actions will always stay at a specific decision scope, of course. But yes, Information and lack thereof. Information is, of course, as I said before, or in my opinion, the most important part of the entire process. I think that information shapes our decisions. When we have a high level of information, we have the best chance to make informed and meaningful decisions and take strategical advantage of the situation as we know it. When we have no information, we have a tendency to be very haphazard in our decision making. Because as the information lacks entirely, we might just do whatever we want. Like, this is a common thing with like beginners, for example. You might see them do all kinds of weird shit because they genuinely have no idea what's going on. They're just throwing things out there, see what sticks. And that's the kind of decision making you get from that. That's why they sometimes get like surprising hits, because they're just guessing basically. But information glut, on the other hand, in normal game design has a tendency to become boring, because you get so much information that, again, the decision becomes a non-decision. It's very obvious what you're supposed to do. And there's another side to this where information glut overstimulates you to a point that you get too much to choose from. So you have a very perfect understanding of a bunch of strategies, but the fact that you have so many to pick from puts you in a sort of paralyzed state where you can't really come to a proper accord in the time you need to. In fencing, the information we get is, from a game theory perspective, complete and somewhat perfect. You see what the fencer opposing you is doing. You see what they have done through possibly a scoreboard or from what you can remember, but you do have a hard time imagining what they're supposed to do. By building prediction, by building information, acquiring information about them, hopefully that can change. But let's talk about information balance and acquisition. And I'm gonna do it by going through briefly the development of poker. Poker started as a card game in the 19th century for the boaters on the Mississippi River. The earliest version was simply called POC, probably inspired from the French, and is what we know today as draw poker. Draw poker has a very specific setup, and also very simple. The opponent draws 5 cards, you draw 5 cards. And this is it. In the very first iteration, there wasn't even betting rounds. You just drew your cards, you see who had the best hand, and that was like taking the ball. It was a pure game of chance. This was changed by the boaters a bit because they wanted to be able to fleece tourists a bit better, so they added a skill element where you could discard cards through betting rounds. You could discard up to all your cards, from 1 to all your cards, between betting rounds. And now I'm simulating that, and what happens here is that, sure, you can guess that because your opponent threw away a few cards that maybe they're building a better hand, but regardless, you have no idea what's going on with your opponent. The only slight indicator is that they're throwing away cards, but that doesn't say anything about what their actual hand looks like. Like, my opponent threw away 2 cards. Maybe he already had a third of a kind in like 6s and is just hoping for a full house with something else. So it doesn't really help me at all. This is a classic case of information starvation. I can't really make any proper choices. Most of it is guesswork. And if I have a very good hand, I'm probably going to play it, and if I have a bad hand, I'm probably not going to play it. So after people got tired of this, they came to the next iteration, which was developed during the Civil War, called stud poker. Stud poker has 2 in the hole for both players and 3 cards face open. This one kind of reverses the problem. In this case, I can see that my opponent has a pair of jacks, and while I have not looked at my own hole down or face down cards yet, even if I have a pair of 10s sort of laying for me there, I still know that he has a pair of jacks. He might have a third one in his hidden cards, so already from this point onwards, I know that I probably shouldn't try to play on this one, because his table cards beat my table cards. And that became the strategy very quickly for stud poker, that if your opponent had good table cards, you just didn't play. And if they didn't, and you seem to have good table cards, then you probably played. The final iteration in the early 20th century was community card poker games. Nowadays the most popular one is No Limit Texas Hold'em. Community card is based on the idea that you have a couple of cards for yourself, and then the entire table shares a set of cards. In Texas Hold'em, this is called the flop. Well, when they lay it out, and then there's a few more turns when they lay out more cards. But basically, I get 2 cards for myself, so do my opponents. We have 1 betting round, So already here we get a chance to see how our opponent is betting and not. And then the flop comes. And now I have a pair of tens, which is great for me, but it's not guaranteed that my opponents don't have another jack sitting there, for example, or anything like that. So now it's not only about strategizing about which cards are on the table, I have to take a more careful look at the betting rounds. Some people will be more aggressive in their betting styles, they might try to bluff you. Some people will be more conservative, they might try to just play if they have a good hand. And the more I figure out about this, the more information I can take in, and the more informed my decisions will be as the play progresses. And yeah, so between each layout of a new card, you also have another betting round, so you can sort of see how player behavior changes as new cards come out. In fencing, there is very little hidden information on the surface. Again, you can see most of the things your opponent is doing. You can learn to balance opportunities between yourself and the opponent. And information balance becomes a question of what you know about your opponent and what the opponent knows about you. In an ideal situation, you manage to perform actions that reveal things about your opponent and their way of fencing and their style without revealing the same information from yourself. And another way to look at information acquisition specifically is to, of course, look at opportunities. This is a more physical aspect. The previous thing is again about like what the fencer is doing, but through affordance and opportunities, we can hope to get a chance to try to feel the future and figure out what we can do from the actions that come next. Affordance is a classic word in usability. Tries to define what the environment offers the individual. The most usual problem in usability and usability design is the door handle problem, as they call it. And this one is a bit peculiar, but basically, if you look at this handle here, you have to think about it like, what does it afford to do with? And in this case, the classical answer is, well, you can grab it, and because you grabbed it, you can now pull it. It like looks like a thing you can pull. And because of that, and as long as the door action that's being pulling matches that, you have decent affordance because the object does as expected from a human being. The opposite of this would be to have a pushing plate, for example, just a plate instead of the handle if you have a push door. And this is a way how affordance affects us in the environment. In fencing, they appear as opportunities for us, in my opinion. It's a physical phenomenon. We have seen this described by masters old and new. The definition of lines, openings, guards, etc. All of these things come together and sort of build the opportunities we see as fencers. And they try to match them as well. Like we see the idea that like, okay, well, if you're in a high guard, then your attack should go to this area. If you're in a low guard, your attack should go to this area, etc., etc. And this mostly holds true. You can build, through the opportunities, you can build yourself a bit of information by sort of understanding what will happen with your opponent. All of these things are factors of distance, speed, and openings. If you look at these two fencers here, for example, at a further distance, a lot of actions are possible for both of us. But if you look carefully, the fencer on the right, the fastest action of the fencer on the right will likely be the simple cut down. Their arm is already in position and they're ready to move from there. For the fencer on the left, of course, the thrust looks like it's going to be the fastest option. At a certain distance, however, the fencer on the right still has a few options. The fastest cut, they can try to switch line, or they can try to drop the point entirely and go across a different line. If I'm worried about those two other options, I can, for example, intentionally constrain it by moving very, very close, if I get the time to do that, that is. Hopefully, by the time I'm close enough, he will only have like one viable option left, and if I know that that's going to be the viable option, I can react accordingly. I can like prepare to have that strike parried before it really happens. And this is a way of using opportunities to build your information. And ultimately, all the information you're acquiring is required, because without information you can't properly build strategy, which will be the next point. Now, again, before I continue, are there any questions so far? perfect. Either I'm entirely incomprehensible or extremely comprehensible. Both are equally scary. So, moving on to strategy and style. A strategy is a decision or a series of decisions in context. They are employed to gauge a response or as a response to other actions played against you. In game theory, the decision points will be specific, and it definitely is what determines when your strategies can be employed. We're going to look a bit at that. But of course, in fencing, the decision points are not specific. They can happen at any time. The definition of a decision point in fencing is like when you decide to do something, basically. At any decision point, there can be multiple viable strategies. As we discussed before, if you have an idea of what to do, there might be more than one thing that you can do at a given decision point. In a game perspective, in game design, and also in game theory, it's considered a good thing when you have several strategies, because it means that you keep the player engaged. In fencing, that might not be what you want. When there's a lack of viable strategies, it leads to a degeneration of the game or the strategy, as no decision making will happen anymore. It has become a non-decision. It is so obvious that you don't spend time considering the options. And style is what I separate from. We're not going to talk too much about style, but I'm separating it from the definition of strategy, because when I'm talking about strategy here, I talk about specific actions. I don't talk about like the overall attitude of a fencer or something like that. With that, I'm using the word style, and we're going to briefly touch on the topic. We're going to do that with a case study of a drill. Now, this drill is a bit of a simplified version of something I do sometimes to train Absätzen, but we're looking at it to sort of gauge strategies. We're going to figure out the strategy sets of fencers at given moments, and we're also going to look at the payoffs of employing a specific strategy. So let me set up the situation. In this drill, the fencer on the right has the goal to land an attack or push the defender off a back line. That is pushing not physically, as in if the attacker steps forward and the defender keeps stepping backward, they will eventually go off a back line, and that will also cause them to lose. So the attacker has two ways in which to gain victory. The defender, on the other hand, does not make an attack. They only try to perform a parry against the attack, and they should not, of course, walk off the back line. If the defender fails to make the parry, if they walk off the line, they lose, and the attacker, of course, again, the goal is to just make the attack or push the defender off. But there's also some information here. Both of these fencers know the goal of each other. It's not hidden from them, like let's assume an instructor has described the drill for them. The fencer on the left is also fairly informed about his own ability to parry. He knows that there's a certain distance required for him to be able to pull that parry off. The fencer on the right, the attacker, knows also the goals of the defender, but he also knows his maximum reach of his attack, along with the maximum distance he can be away from the defender where his attack will be unparryable still. In these situations where they're standing right now, they are both out of distance. That means that, like, while they technically can perform their actions or strategies, that wouldn't lead to anything. Trying to defend now wouldn't mean anything because there would be nothing to defend against. An attack, it's too far out to reach. So, the question I have for you now, can anyone think of a couple of strategies for these two fencers to change the current situation? That's a question.
The right fencer could just walk in without attacking.
The left could do the same thing as well.
Any more?
The right fencer could throw an attack out of range to try to provoke a parry.
Absolutely. But of course, since the defense on the right doesn't want to provoke the parry, they simply want to hit. They don't want to get parried. If they get parried, they lose. So just to reiterate that point, the defender on the left only has to parry to make a point and win this game. They don't have to be able to follow up with an attack or riposte.
The fencer on the right can hold their sword behind them and run forwards.
They can also do that. Most of the things you're saying land into a specific strategy set. And if we look at all of the available strategies to the fencer at this moment, they look something like this. Either fencer could choose to advance, either fencer could spend the time it takes to advance to stay still, or either fencer could choose to retreat. This creates, the fact that we have symmetrical action creates the best case scenario for what game theorists love. We're gonna make a payoff matrix. Take a few seconds to look at this one. With the payoff matrix, I am trying to gauge the utility gain in values for both fencers based on both their employed strategies. In this case, the color coding is not to indicate good or bad, it's just that green is the attacker and red is the defender. The zeros I have decided to not color code because that means no change in utility. So, first of all, I need to explain this, because if you have never seen this before, it might be a bit daunting. The reason I have chosen numbers is because it takes a bit too much time, or it takes too much space rather, to write in the exact result of each action. But basically, the utility gain valuations here are based on the information they know about each other. The attacker knows that they want to get closer, because they want to make an attack that hits. And they also know that if they get so close that they can make that attack, that they reach that distance where the attack is unparryable, they also like that very much. The defender similarly wants to be at a certain distance where they can perform the parry still and successfully perform it, but they don't want to get so close where the opponent's attack can't be parried. That gives us the valuation we have now. But I need to emphasize this. The values assigned to all of these strategical actions are based entirely on the information we know. If the attacker has no idea what their distance is, what their maximum reach is, for example, the distance where they can even reach with the attack, they cannot assign a value to the action of advancing or staying still while their opponent is doing the same. They don't know what that means for them. So that's why the values in this matrix is given by the fencers themselves, not necessarily by me. It's based entirely on the information. But so to ask another question then, if I as the attacker want to increase my probability of getting good value, what is the action that I should perform? What is my strategy if I'm the attacker?
Is it to
advance?
I think I heard advance. Yes, that is correct. Basically, what's happening here is that when the attacker advances, in 2 out of 3 cases, that is if the opponent advances or they stay or they retreat, in 2 out of these, advance and stay, the fencer on the right, the attacker, will gain value. So if I decide to advance and my opponent is randomizing the response, I have a 66% chance of gaining something and a 33% chance of nothing happening at all and the same situation showing up. So as a defender, if we flip on it, looking again at the probability cause, what would be the defender's preferred action?
Staying in place?
That is also correct. The defender has a 33% chance of gaining value and both when they advance and when they stay. However, what influences the defender in this case is the fact that they have another 33% chance of losing value if they also advance and the attacker does it. Staying is a very safe choice. And because of this, and let's say that because of the information that they know about each other, this is exactly what happens. And the attacker steps forward, the defender stays put. Now they're a bit closer. This changes the strategy set. The attacker is now so close that they can perform their action. The defender knows this. The attacker is not so close that they're guaranteed to land the attack. They're just close enough where they can make an attack and the defender can parry it. This means that they both have an option to execute their actions. The strategy set here becomes a bit interesting. First of all, the question I want to ask with this one, can anyone see what the huge problem with this strategy set is?
There's so many negatives.
For the defender.
There is no option to fall back or to retreat.
Partially. If we focus specifically on the gain of the defender.
He's screwed.
This is a fairly accurate response. Out of 16 total actions, only 1 result in a gain for the defender at this point. 6 out of the total actions result in a gain for the attacker. And again, the gain of the utility here is defined by the fact that the attacker is advancing to a distance where they can perform the action without being worried about, without having to worry about it getting parried. So in this case, if the attacker advances, there's a 75% chance, if the opponent is choosing randomly, to gain something, and a 25% chance of the same situation happening. In all other cases, there is less chance of gaining something. Execute, that is, that the attacker makes their attack, wins in half of the cases, but has a 25% chance of losing value overall, because you lose the game. He will get parried if he does the attack now. So something interesting is happening here. So if you look at it from the defender's perspective, if the attacker ultimately chooses the optimal choice from a probability perspective and advances, we see that the retreater only has one strategy left to choose from. And when this cycle starts, we end up in something that in game theory is called a Nash equilibrium. And this is a very peculiar case, but basically what it means is that, like, if we repeat this game over and over, there is no incentive for either player to change their strategy as long as they assume the other player does not, or it will not change their strategy. So as long as I as an attacker think that the opponent won't change their strategy, that they won't step forward, or that they won't stay still, or that they won't advance, or whatever, or try to make a parry in the air, I just keep going. And equally for the defender, unless they think that I'm gonna change the specific strategy, otherwise I'm just gonna keep going. These are the best value cases for both of us at this moment. And in this drill, we're eventually gonna run into a problem, because if you remember from before, there is a backline, and now the defender is getting dangerously close. So if we now have arrived at a situation where the defender is on the edge of the backline, the attacker is outside of distance, like in distance to make the attack, but outside of distance to be guaranteed to hit it, what does the valuation look like for the defender now? I didn't animate it, but we're now in a situation where upon the attacker's advance, the defender loses in every single scenario. We have effectively degenerated the strategy. Before I move on, are there any questions on this? Because I understand if it can be daunting. Okay, cool. So strategies that give us utility or good outcomes are considered viable. When only one strategy exists, it can be considered degenerate. So in this case, the fact that I can keep advancing to keep gaining utility, or at the very least not to lose utility, means that that strategy is great for me. I'm gonna keep doing it. We will always encounter an entropy towards strategy degeneration. In this case, it's a drill, and I would argue that it is a poor game design that causes the degeneration to happen this early. I actually ran this drill with my students, and what happened was that they didn't immediately start doing this. No one usually does. It takes a bit of time to build up the information and understanding of a game or drill to start working on the generating strategies. So if you present something that is poorly designed, you're not going to see the effects of that immediately in a drill situation. But even when there isn't a poor game design that causes the degeneration of the strategy, the participant's skill is a constant work towards it. If I do an improved version, I'm going to show that, and if you suddenly if you have someone like Martin Fabian doing it versus someone who's never held a sword before, Martin is going to degenerate his own strategies towards that situation pretty quickly. And of course, as a final point, again, we can try to add more viable strategies, but having more than 2 at any given time, or 2 or 3, adds complexity without adding depth to the game. You're not really helping the player engage more, you're just giving them a harder challenge. Let's change this out a bit. So instead of the defender not being allowed to do anything but parry and walk backward, or like they can walk however they want of course, but basically they can only parry, the defender can now make an attack on the preparation, as in they can try to make a counter-attack on the attacker as they try to move in. Sorry, not a counter-attack, just like they can make their own attack towards the attacker as they're closing distance. However, if both attacks hit simultaneously, the attacker retains priority. That is, that the attacker's attack will count and not the defender's. Information-wise, even if these fencers know the exact same thing about each other as they did in the previous case, we still have a lot of new things to consider. The attacker now has to think about how close can I really get without triggering their response, and how is my own parry or voiding, or if the drill requires them that they can't parry, they can only try to back away or not end up in a situation where that happens in the first place, and things like that. So the attacker now has a few more things to consider, and so does the defender. Should the defender double down on the strategy of trying to take the parry, finding that distance properly, or should they try to see if they can go the attacker into coming too close to make sure, so the attacker thinks that they can make that attack, and then nail them with the preparation attack instead. This way, I haven't made a payoff matrix for this one because we've already exited the scope of where these things go on. This previous exercise we managed to mathematically prove is unbalanced. This one will become unbalanced eventually as fencer skill improves, but for now it has an array of possibilities available for both fencers. And we go outside the classical game theory perspective because this is proper game design where the goals are fairly simple, but the interaction between both fencers is highly active. I think one thing I would say about exercises or drills like this is that they should feel it in their brain as much as their bodies. And yeah, I added thing for this one as well. So execute is an action almost at any given time now, and you don't quite know when you're supposed to do it. So yeah, in drills, if you're making drills, the design should not inherently degenerate strategies. The goal of the fencer is to degenerate those strategies. You need to find places where you can perform to the best of your ability, and where these decisions that you've been taking so far become very obvious and very easy. Sorry, was that a question? Okay. And as you switch people out in drills, these strategies will still change because different fences will have different interactions with each other. Oh, Andreas, your mic is on. Sorry. Anyways, where was I? Right. So, in a drill, it is useful to keep the viable strategies to a specific set. So, if both fencers are working towards separate goals or the same goal and can employ different strategies, they both have a chance to learn something different when working with a drill. And in terms of fencing in general, when you have been degenerated, so to speak, you've probably been funneled into what's considered the area of excellence. And this was a term coined by Johan Harmenberg in his book EP 2.0, or the new paradigm of fencing. And the basic idea of it is that like you build up a strong suit of a very few amount of actions, and you try to put your opponent in a position where you can work with those actions. And that's basically working towards the same ideal, that like you have a few good things that you can nail at any time as long as the setup is right. So most of your fencing is based on getting that setup done. If you're fencing someone that can always hit you in the hand, for example, at any given point, you might first think that like, okay, well, I just need to see when that happens and then like parry the hit towards my hand when it comes. But it's never going to be that easy, because if they can land that hit so solidly, they've probably like already guaranteed the hit 1 to 2 actions before. So you need to sort of scale back, and you need to like expand your information acquisition and try to figure out what are they doing? Like, how do they put me in a position where they can constantly hit me on the hand like that? Like, do they draw me out of a guard? Like, do they make me move in a way that like opens up my arm, or are they just like putting their sword in a position so I think they will go somewhere else, and then they've already targeted the hand? Because again, most of the time, if someone has zeroed in on a place on you, managing to like counteract the hit in itself will be almost impossible. So I just wanted to talk briefly about style. This is one of the last parts. Style is essentially your approach to fencing. There are different styles of fencing, and there are different ways of defining styles in fencing. In L'Esprit d'Épée, the classic wheel, and this was made by Nicholas, by the way, from the server. The classic way is looking at 4 different kinds of fencers. 2 of them start by stepping into distance first, and 2 of them start by letting the opponent step into distance first. And depending on if you're the one who steps into distance first, if you attack first or you let the opponent attack first, you're a kind of fencer. Or if you let them step into distance first and you attack first, or you let them attack first, you're also a different kind of fencer. Most of the time you will naturally gravitate towards some sort of standard style. It's simply a way of how you express your strategy employment. It's the way you try to find your own area of excellence, and like how you want to work with it. And from there you get a chance to sort of move with some basic ideas, some basic tools that you use most of the time. This comes back to the motivation thing, as I mentioned earlier. Like, your style is based on what you consider to be like valuable. It can be based on interpretation, it can be based on previous skill, or just again those specific moves you can pull off at any given time. However, an ability to mix styles becomes important, because it's going to start to set different expectations. Both Johan Hammerberg and poker star Dan Harrington agrees on this. Dan has a similar approach to Harmenberg, because Harmenberg says that if you're fencing an aggressive opponent, you should yourself become aggressive to sort of like counteract like their own strengths. And similarly, if you're fencing a defensive opponent, be defensive yourself, so they can't use that like defensive advantage against you if you're not that great at attacks, for example. Dan Harrington talks about how the fact that if your table is full of aggressive players, you gotta follow along with that, because otherwise they're gonna steal a bunch of easy pots, and it's gonna be impossible to spring back after. Whereas if you're in a table with conservative players, you actually have the time to wait for good hands yourself, and you might as well like join in on that. And he also adds the point that like either way, you're gonna get the most success when you start to set different expectations by playing away from your style. And here's a small little thing just before we end, which I call the Federation Paradox. And this is just basically beginner's luck. That is, if you fence new fencers, or if you fence like odd fencers, or whatever you want to call it, you might see them pull weird strategies out of their ass that you've never seen before. And this is based on the idea that like the Enterprise starship in Star Trek, every episode they get subjected to some really weird stuff. But every time they manage to solve it with a new solution that seemingly was never thought of before. So they just solve things over and over again using completely new things. This is great for the Enterprise. However, hopefully those things won't stick around for like beginner fencers. On the other hand, if they do, you'll eventually be able to build a strategy set around that as well. So it's nothing too much to worry about. But so when you meet someone who has an extremely unorthodox style, don't worry too much about it. Either it's a new thing and you will have to get used to it, or it's just going to be a thing that sort of dies out pretty quickly as they realize they've been beat somehow. So, in summary, decision making is an important ability for a fencer, but I think it remains the sum of many parts. If you lack information acquisition, or like the ability to acquire information, strategical consideration, and mechanical and technical comprehension, you will have a hard time making those meaningful decisions. Achieving victory is helped by strategy generation. When nothing is left but the obvious action, your victory is almost guaranteed. And in drilling situations, I think that both participating parties should have the ability to express their fencing through viable strategies. And that's me. Are there any questions? Damn.
Good lecture.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't tell if I was just so incomprehensible. There's nothing to talk about, or anything like that. But yeah, let's see.
I guess my main question that I threw out into the text chat was this is all very technical and has a lot of the knowledge that instructors and people building drills would have in terms of like the no downside actions and things, but do you have an example of a way that you could take a less good drill, so like a drill or a game that is not teaching those decision-making actions very well, and then modifying it for beginners so that you can teach these things without having to go, all right, so now our no downside action, and using the terms? Like, how would you teach this in a class using more simple terms for like somebody who shows up, it's their very first intermediate class after finishing the beginner section sort of thing, if that makes sense?
Yeah, somewhat. I hope I can give an adequate reply to this, because truth be told, like I'm still developing this mindset for myself still. Like this drill that I did here is like an example. So the drill that is showcased in the lecture is something I did use to some success in the club, and like the basic way it sort of emphasizes decision making is because the way that the actions that are available to the fencers mean that they get a specific strategy set. So you need to limit them, but not too much. So a decision-making drill is almost always competitive by nature, but it can also be like slightly compliant. How you want to balance that is gonna have to be a bit up to you. But basically what you're looking for is like, you want to set up a situation. And in this situation you want to be able to I can't believe I stopped streaming. Sorry. And in this situation you want to be able to understand a few actions that a fencer can take. In this case, that drill was working on like, okay, well, I want the attacker to focus on their attack, but I also want the defender to focus on specifically upsets, and was the attempt. The full drill includes a parry riposte from the defending fencer. So upsets and in longsword would have been the goal of that drill. So as the defender, that's what I want to perform. But I want to keep the attacker honest. So that's why the defender gets the sort of attack on preparation concept. So practically what that means is basically any drill that you look at, first of all, you have to look at you have to see it from a perspective. You don't have to make a payoff matrix every single time you design a drill. Don't worry about that. I didn't do that until yesterday, basically. That was the payoff matrices for this presentation was the first ones I ever did. But you have to sort of think of it. You have to think of it in a longer term explanation. You have to think like, if I make a drill, will one of the actions performed by one of the fencers make it trivially easy very quickly? Or is there something I can give, like a little thing, to the other fencer that will help balance the nature, that will keep the other fencer honest, etc., etc. But most importantly, it's also about limitations, so that the fencers don't have too much to think about in the drill scenario. Because at least my perspective from it is that you want to have a bit of a limit, so that the fencers only work with a few decisions at once, so to speak. Because again, if you just want to let them loose and think about everything, that's called sparring, and you just let them do that. Drills are designed to hone in on specific strategies that you can take. So again, in the case of the Absetzen drill, it's like, well, okay, the attacker, okay, I'm an attacker, I want to set myself in position, I want to find a sweet spot where I can perform the attack, I want to maybe lure the defender so that they might try to throw their like preparation attack towards me, and maybe I can win on the priority on that, or maybe I can just win by aggressively stepping in and making them think I will attack, or like so they parry early or something like that, whereas the defender is thinking in terms of like, okay, well, I need to keep a certain distance so my parry is successful, and so that I can continue with the absets and riposte, but I also need to like let him know that my preparation attack is available at any moment, and I need to punish it when it sort of happens. So these are a few things that they think about, but it hopefully shouldn't be too excessive for them, so to speak. And it hopefully should like give them the chance to sort of fall in on that. Does this at least mildly answer your question?
Somewhat.
Yeah.
I was thinking more like simply practical, like, cool, 2 fencers. I want you to do this, you to do this, you to do this, you to do this. Do you then add in a second action after they do the one action? Like, how would you practically teach it in the moment so that you're guiding them through getting into this decision-making process, like, as the practical drill set?
Right, you mean like that. Right, so I don't think you always have to have a build-up on these exercises. Basically, like, you don't have to start with one that is fundamentally broken and then add the sweet thing that makes it work better. And I'm not certain I would have, in general, like an addition. I think you should make a complete drill and only reduce things if that starts out too complex. Do you sort of get me? Because
yeah, that makes
yeah, because the one reason you might want to start with, for example, the broken drill in this case is because, yeah, if you're doing it with new ones, it might be too complex. Because again, as I said, when I did the broken version of this drill with my fencers, they didn't immediately do the degenerated strategy. They did the normal stuff. They attacked, they defended, and the defender won a bunch of cases because the attacker was like, well, I can't step too close, obviously. So sometimes you might want to do that. But if you think that your students can handle it, then by all means just do the one drill and don't like work so much with complexity levels. I hope that makes better sense.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Which is, I watched a video of some person where he's bald, and you probably know his name. He has a channel about longsword stuff, and he talked about like the basic of decision making, which was like, I think, defense, offense, and opportunity. Like, how would you like, what would you say are the most basic things of decision making?
Well, I mean, that was basically sort of what I was going through mostly in this lecture. So the basic things of decision making are like meaningful choice, which is built by a comprehensive system, a consistent system, and information. Without these 3 things, you will have a very hard time to make meaningful choices. And without meaningful choices,
like, because currently I'm training with beginners. And I want to, like, I teach them technique, but now I want to focus a bit more on decision making. How would you like break it down a lot so that beginners can understand that in a sensible way?
Okay, no, I think I understand. So again, this opportunity thing is a pretty good start, I think. that is like understanding the openings of the fencer and understanding like simple stuff like, again, the example I pulled off in the lecture during the opportunity part, which is like, if you have an opponent standing in a very high guard, you can tell fencers that like, well, what you can end up teaching fencers is that like, well, from this position their fastest attack is going to be straight down, right? But if you're very far out, they can theoretically start with anything, but as you compress that distance, you're sort of limiting again their options. They can still choose to do something different, but you can hopefully, through a drill, for example, say if you have an attacker advancing and you tell the other person who's standing in the high guard to be ready to attack at some point, if they end up always doing like a very, like if they're standing in a high guard and always attack from the lowest point underneath, that's going to take a way longer time than just striking straight down from where they are. This can be punished by the other fencer, who will simply strike them in the head as they do this, or something like that. And their attack will of course be faster when the distance is decently collapsed. Stuff like that. So I think opportunity is a pretty decent start, just looking at the openings, things like that. Distance, actually. Distance and opportunity is like the distance is by far the biggest thing, because outside of distance you don't even have a decision point to consider.
Yeah.
I hope that made sense.
Just for, like, if I can interject quickly with something which might be useful on that previous question. Something I often use for a case like this for teaching decisions to beginners is that I'll set up a little like isolated or a drill where one fencer takes a beginning action, like steps forward and pushes on the opponent's sword, for example. And then the opponent has a choice about how they can respond to it. Maybe they can step backwards or they can push it across. They have a simple, like, generally two choices about their options. And then the attacker finishes their attack in one way or the other. So if they feel their sword get pushed back away, they might drop it and cut the hand on the other side. If they don't feel they get pushed away, they can go directly and then hit at the body. And what these things are doing is they're starting to hone the idea of recognizing, trying to set something up, and then recognizing what case you're actually in, and therefore how you need to proceed from there to get a useful result. If you try to, attack directly when they push your sword away, you'll miss and they can hit you, and you get direct feedback about whether the decision you made was correct for the situation you had.
Sorry, maybe I had a question regarding degenerated games. So basically, I ran the two games you mentioned like 1 or 2 years ago, and maybe you could argue that learning to spot a degenerated situation is actually a skill that your beginners need to understand. So would you consider it problematic to run one of these flow drills if you think they can learn something valuable at the end? Because when I ran the very first, problematic drill with degenerated strategies, then you could consider that for beginners it's an actual drill, and for more experienced fencers it's maybe closer to a coach drill, where the defender will make the attacker work, but the attacker is still the one who will prevail in the end.
There is a possibility to do that. Like in the terms of the advanced fencers, I am struggling a bit to see the point, because again, once the right fencer has figured it out, it is a very simple process. They simply step forwards. Or sorry, once the attacking fencer has figured it out, they simply step forward. From a beginner's perspective, I can sort of understand it, because it can put a beginner who is a defender in a position of like this is why you need to be able to do more actions, or like this is why you need to learn more or whatever, or why you can't always be defensive because you might end up in trouble based on different situations. I totally think what you said at the beginning, that using broken drills can be a valuable way to teach how strategy degenerates. But again, in the terms of like advanced fencers, once they have figured out the pattern, especially in the broken part, I don't see any further point to like home in the point further. But maybe you can convince me about that. I'm not certain. It's just how I feel right now about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. But basically, I think the difficulty I was facing with my beginners, because obviously I spotted very early that the drill was flawed in a sense. Like it was possible to just run forward and hit the opponent in the face and you're done. But basically, the idea was how to bridge the gap between, let's say, a simple direct attack drill. Like your beginners know how to perform a direct attack against a static opponent, and make it less static without learning the attack on the preparation first. Because basically, well, beginners need to understand why the attack on the preparation exists in the first place, which is it is an answer to the fact that even if you want to parry, it's not always possible, and you have to act before it's too late. And maybe what I mean is that it's not like the full game is maybe a little bit too complex, because the more options there are, the more the skill floor, the higher the skill floor, I would say.
No, I agree entirely with that point, though, because yes, like if you can't even understand like how the so-called broken game sort of generates, like then you're gonna end up like having a hard time getting all the options thrown at you at once. This follow again the basic paradigm of like there needs to be sort of viable strategy available to both fencers. And honestly, even in the broken game, as long as the attacker is still sort of like having not figured out the obvious strategy and is still sort of going a bit back and forth trying to find that perfect distance, as long as that still happens, the defender is going to learn useful defensive mechanics. It's just that as soon as you reach that point where the attacker has it fully figured out, you need to step it up.
Yeah, it becomes obsolete rather quickly. But basically, the idea was when you're teaching beginners, maybe one needs to be aware that their decision-making and planning abilities may be fairly low, perhaps because they're obsessing over some technical stuff, or perhaps because they just don't understand the motions yet, or they cannot spot them. So I think maybe you can get away with flow drills with beginners. Obviously, for more experienced fencers, you need games that are worth playing, that are not degenerated.
I think if you're teaching beginners, you should focus on teaching them the basics first, and giving them all the decision theory, game theory stuff a little bit later, after they have mastered all the fundamentals, when they can make sense of them, because all of this is a fairly advanced stuff that can work when you already have a mastery of what is what.
Do you think that do you think it would be useful to present like a type of broken game for the purpose of having your students figure out how to create the broken scenario? And then once they get...
Yeah, that was basically what Adrian was looking a bit at.
Yeah, that's what I pretty much asked.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, so basically there are like two paths in this scenario. Like, I mean, okay, yeah, the short answer is yes. Letting people understand, like, I like game design, so I think it's obvious that like letting people understand the functions of game design is pretty important, because like if they can sort of get that properties working around in their head, they might think more accurately about it when you present them with other drills. Like in my club now, when I do longsword drills, some of my students are aware enough so that they start pointing out these issues to me before I even get to hold the drill. So it's like I've done similar drills that are also broken, and I do it again as a part to have reduced complexity in the start. Um, and some advanced students are like, wait a minute, I can just do this and I'll win. I'm like, shut up, yeah, we're gonna get to that. So that happens too, but yes, ultimately I would say yes. I would say like be a bit careful, because like if you just do it, the entire point is that like you're thinking about it. So like if you just make a drill and you haven't like thought like at least casually like, can this drill be abused somehow, then you probably need to think a little bit more about your drill. But if you introduce an exploitable drill and you're open about it, then it's perfectly fine. Then you can like be open about it. Some fencers might not immediately understand the point, because when you tell them that like, hey, you know, you can just abuse it like this, they'll be like, why are you even teaching us this? So you have to be a bit careful. But basically, as soon as they are at the stage, as soon as that coin has fallen down, so to speak, they're ready to sort of go to a more complex variant.
One thing that I like to do perhaps as a teacher is basically use some form of maybe social engineering. Like you're a bit living game theory, but from a social point of view, I wouldn't say you would shame them, but you would make them understand that the game is flawed, but they shouldn't try to like work on the flows of the game, and instead try to use a more balanced strategy. I mean, maybe I'll give a more concrete example, which is I usually start like teaching the crossing by using a very simple binding game. So two fencers are crossed at the point, and they must hit the opponent straight from the crossing. No cutting around. The only action allowed is from the inside crossing. And it's very obvious that you can make the entire game pointless just by standing into a parring position and never leaving it. But it's pretty obvious that the game becomes meaningless. So I tell my students that, okay, you need to be a bit proactive, you need to try to score opportunities, you need to play with your partner in order to score something, in order to do something, because we know that stalling is easy and that's not the point.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you can introduce the cut around later and you end up with the two first Fiore plays, which is thrust directly or cut around.
Yep.
But as an introductory device, maybe it may be worse. I mean, that's just my opinion, but in my experience, like using a form of social engineering, I would say, could somehow help you deal with the flaws in a game.
Yeah, sure, that is one part of it, but you also have to consider that like the game isn't necessarily it's not flawed in the same way, because like ultimately, if you look at it from a utility game perspective, the person who keeps parrying eventually doesn't gain any more utility from it.
Yeah, I actually was just about to bring up that, you know, the similar winding drill, like, you know, two people are in a bind, they must stay in the bind, it's against the rules to leave the bind. If your goal is to not get hit, then you just go into like cron or whatever, and then you'll never get hit because they can never hit you without leaving the bind.
Yeah.
But if you, I mean, you can try to shift their goal towards, you know, landing a point and like touching the opponent. And if you do that, then, you know, they'll always have to present their point to their opponent, and thus the opponent will always have a chance to, like, the game will continue, I guess.
Yeah.
Or you can try to fix it by making going into cone, or going into high guard, high parry, simply turning it into a fail state, and there you go. You've also fixed the game that way.
Yeah. There are always like a lot of solutions. The question comes back to like how your fencers are sort of strategizing around it. So the danger here is like, you have to think about, why does a fencer choose to omit all offensive actions to focus on the defensive one in a game where an offensive action is winning? Why did they end up doing this? Like, are they afraid? Are they frustrated? Etc, etc. Like a fencer that never attacks an only defense is obviously doing it because one thing is easy and the other isn't. So you have to sort of, you might have to find an intermediary step, like I don't know, like find a position first and then like do the attack from there or something like that. So then you have like a sort of soft reset within that space that is like enforced by the game, sort of. Stuff like that. Adding more fail states is absolutely a way, because like you can simulate the fact that like if you go too high or if you go too far on the side, then the opponent will cut around. So there's also a way of solving it. But like most of the time, you just need to the perspective you need to look from is just like, okay, all my students are choosing, or specific students are choosing specific strategies. Like, is this a problem with the student, or not the problem with the student, but like, is this a problem with their comprehension of the game or the game itself, basically? And that's like where you start and go from there. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, were there any other questions? I have all night, so if you want to chat about it too, that's definitely possible. But yeah, if anyone had any questions now. Yeah, so my final point is that this is probably, yeah, it's a bit like fuzzy and diffuse if you've sort of never heard about it, and I hope I wasn't like terrorizing anyone with the payoff matrix, but I just wanted to sort of show like what this looks like from a perspective of sort of design, ultimately. So yeah, if I made something too complex, and if you figured it out like tomorrow that I made something too complex, like again, just don't hesitate to ask about it. I've been recording this entire thing, of course, and it's gonna be coming up, and so are the slides, of course. So there will be a chance to review and look things through. And those of you from my club here can of course ask me in the Spiff court about anything also. Other than that though, I don't think I have anything more to say right now. Thank you very much for coming. It's very nice to see so many of you, and I hope you feel like you learned something useful ultimately.
Thank you for giving the talk, and now I understand the thing about the matrices. So yeah.
It was very informative. Thank you.
Definitely really good and gave me a couple of insights.